Hello, my name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and when I first began talking about the economic crisis, it was in March 2007. I delivered a paper before a closed network called the Positive Deviant Network, and it was a 148-page paper, and I presented this to this network, and in it I predicted that we're headed for another Great Depression. And at the time, everything seemed all right. There were a few trouble signs on the horizon, but our economy had proved much more resilient than anybody had ever thought. The dot-com bubble had crashed in 2007, the greatest speculative bubble since in the United States since the 1920s, and we seemed to have recovered nicely. But that wasn't what I saw, and that wasn't what I felt. I predicted that the real estate market was about to implode. Prices would drop 40 to 70%. Stock market would ultimately go down 70 to 90%, and that we soon be on the verge of another Great Depression. And truly, within months after I made these predictions, things began to happen like that. That summer, $2 billion hedge funds, Bear Stearns, that invested in subprime properties went to zero, lost 97% of their value. All right? 2 months after that, in August 2007, a credit contraction shook world markets. 1 year later, Wall Street banks hit their knees. And if it wasn't for the vast liquidation, the assistance of the Federal Reserve, Wall Street would have been wiped off the earth, much like it happened during the 1930s. And a Great Depression would have then ensued. But it didn't. They had learned something from the Great Depression, that you had to save the very mechanism of credit itself, the banks, or the whole thing was going to go into the toilet. And so they did. But they didn't save them. They merely postponed the day of reckoning. What I'm going to talk about in these next two programs is the economic crisis from the standpoint of two different countries, Japan and China. Because as we are going through this crisis, what happens in one part of the world affects what happens in another part of the world. And truly, we are in the same boat. All of us are. The Japanese, the Chinese, the Americans, the Africans, the Europeans, the Koreans, the Indonesians, the Argentines. What joins us is an economic system built on credit and debt. That system is about to pass away. And we already see its shakings around us. For the hopeful, they believe that we're going to survive. We're going to survive this latest crisis just as we survived the many other crises that capitalism has survived before it. But those are merely hopes. When the 2000 bubble collapsed in 2000, dot-com bubble, and what happened after that, I had expected that to happen. And those who understand what this crisis is about expected it also. Ludwig von Mises, the great Austrian economist, the Austrian school itself, said what was going to happen in 1949, that we were going to experience somewhere down the line a crack-up boom, a last blow-off of credit that was going to end in the complete economic conflagration of the Western economic system. That crack-up boom began to happen in 1985. Prices went higher and higher and higher, blew up in 2000, was reflated by the United States Federal Reserve with a property bubble that replaced the stock market bubble. That blew up in 2008. They've frantically thrown trillions of dollars at it. Stock markets are struggling to go back to where they once were 10 years ago. Trying to reach it, they're going to lose. And if not, those values that are going to come are going to be increasingly driven by worthless paper. Now, everyone, the United States, France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Japan, and even China are going to go down in this last great event. Now, what I want to say is, although if you have your security based on this economic system, you have much to fear. Because what you have known that is true is going to pass away. We are living through a historical epoch of tremendous significance. But I want to tell you something. A better world is going to come on its heels. The collapse of the present system is going to give rise to the world, a world that we have not yet even seen or can even barely imagine. But first, the present world must pass away, and it is. And I want to talk about this passing of the world from the standpoint of two different countries, not the United States, which is the usual model, or of Europe, which is the usual model that we've seen. Even the East has tried to imitate this model of growth and expansion. So from the standpoint of two powers in the East, I want to point out what is going to happen to the world itself, to the global economy. The first point of view I'm going to take you on is that of Japan. Now, before the bankers, the British bankers, came up with leveraged paper money, with debt as money, and created this extraordinary expansion, the technological age, the era that we've just finishing up, the world was basically divided into the East and West in a certain way. And the West represented the male side of things, all right? It represented that Western aggressive approach to reality, all right? The East was more passive. It was the yin nature, contemplative, waiting, all right, going within. And it didn't mean that you didn't have battles and power struggles in the East, but they were of a different nature than in the West. And East and West existed separately. Both had their own histories, both had their own ups and downs, but they pretty much existed separately before the last 400 years. But when England got a hold of debt-based money and credit, it fueled an extraordinary expanse of Western power, leading to the largest empire since Rome. And in this imperialistic advance, England marched across the world, took over India, and started to absorb China itself and Russia. But like the prey too big for the snake to swallow, England's jaws couldn't absorb what it was trying to eat. And so Russia and China both escaped the maws of Western imperialism and took upon themselves an entirely different economy, because the Western system was designed and run out of the West as a mechanism that would allow the West to absorb the entire wealth and the countries of the rest of the world. And China resisted, and Russia resisted. And so they took upon themselves an economic system unlike the West, a system they called communism, all right? But this system was doomed to failure. What the West system of capitalism was done, it was based upon, and it was a bastard iteration of supply and demand. It was a bastardized iteration that was built upon debt instead of savings as money, and credit replacing real demand as the false demand. It was like the West had come up with a system based on steroids. And this is what capitalism really was. The East, afraid of this system because they didn't want to be its victims, came up with something called communism, something that was made up by Marx, a theorist, who said you could take all the benefits of productivity, split it up, and not give it to the bankers. He was wrong. You could do it, but it wasn't going to work. And in fact, what happened was Marx's system brought together both economic, civil, and political power in one place. And the one thing humanity has done when given unlimited opportunity is it's given rise to unlimited tyranny. So in the name of creating a better and just world where the bankers didn't take advantage of the helpless, you saw the rise of a tyrannical system that did more damage in its 60 to 70 years on the earth than almost any system had done before. The palliative to the bankers' dominance and squeezing the productivity of its victims to its own benefit was offset by a communist system that produced even more inequity than that which it attempted to replace. This is a perfect example of resist not evil. Because very often, when you try and right a wrong, you will do a wrong even worse than the wrong you are trying to right. This isn't an attempt to explain away capitalism. This isn't an attempt to say you shouldn't have done it, because history is as history is. It merely explains what happened. Now, Japan in the East was awoken from its slumber by the appearance of Americans' gunboats, Commodore Perry, who came into Japan and forced the Japanese doors to open to the West. You have to realize that the East didn't want to have anything to do with the West. The East had its own empires. The East had its own traditions. The East had its own history. And it ignored that of the West. It didn't want to do anything with the West. Now the West, being more male, more yang, more aggressive, wanted to take the East over for its own. And so the United States, being closer to Asia than Western Europe, the powers of England, France, Germany, etc., 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 and the Netherlands, decided to go and poach one of its prizes on its own to have for itself. And so it set its sights on Japan. They sent Commodore Perry in with his gunboats, trained him on the Japanese Tokugawa regime, and basically said, if you don't let us in, we're going to blow the holy hell out of you. Well, the Japanese knew that their cannons, that the Japanese armaments, and these were a militaristic tradition. The Japanese were a tradition, they were a warrior tradition. The word samurai has meaning in Japan. The warrior of the cult ran all the way through their history. And so when they saw a superior force, the Japanese reacted as only the Japanese could. The Japanese tradition was of taking the best of what others had and regurgitating it and coming up with a Japanese iteration of what they saw as a threat. So soon after Commodore Perry's gunboats ran into Japan with their cannons, the Japanese reacted very, very quickly. They signed a treaty with the Americans to keep them at bay. And the next thing they did was they sent teams of Japanese students to the West to understand who were these people, what did they have, and how could we best utilize what they've gained to our advantage. Now, it's a very curious thing. The Japanese sent not only students to the West, but their brightest minds. They wanted to go all over and to see who were these people and who should we copy. Well, when they got back home, the country they decided to copy was Germany. Now, why did the Japanese think the Germans had the best model? Well, because the Japanese were the Eastern equivalent of the Germans. They both were highly disciplined. They both were hierarchical. They both had armies. They liked armies. They liked armaments, and they both followed directions. So they went over. They may have loved Italian food, but the Italians were a bit dodgy when it came to hierarchy. The French, well, they were not as bad as the Italians. The British had a very defined hierarchy too. But what the Japanese loved was the German militarism and the German top-down hierarchy, because it mirrored their own way of doing things. So what happened is the Japanese put their response into high gear. And by the end of the 19th century, in 1896, they fought a war with a Western power, Russia, and they won, much to the shock of the West. Now what happened is that then, coming into the early 20th century, the great world wars began setting in motion. And when the West went to war, when Germany went to war with the rest of the world, with the rest of the West, with Russia, with Europe, with England, and eventually the United States, the Japanese had already picked their sides. The Japanese had already decided the century before that the Germans had a superior model. The Germans understood order. The Germans understood discipline. The Germans understood purity. The Germans were in fact a Western reflection of the Japanese ethos, just as the Japan was a reflection of the German ethos. There were two peas in a pod. And when Germany rose up with fascism to rule the world that appeared to them disorderly and in need of order, the Japanese took upon this chance to do the same thing in Asia. And so when fascism arose in the early part of the 20th century, Japan and Germany were joined. And the conflagration that took over the whole world, called World War II, brought down both Germany in the West and Japan in the East. Now, at mid-century, both these powers were in dust and tatters. Japan was hit by the atomic bomb. Their cities were totally destroyed. Germany in the West was also a shadow of its former self. Smashed by the Western powers in World War I, ground into dust by the Treaty of Versailles, it arose once again and once again was destroyed by the West. But the West had learned something, that its treaty with Germany was so onerous, it gave rise to a rage that led to another war. Their triumph was short-lived, because when you destroy your opponent, you created an enemy virtually for life. And this is a mistake that the United States had done with the South during the Civil War. The United States, the North, didn't just win the battle. What the South remembered was Sumter's march to the ocean, where they burned the South, where they destroyed everything in their path. They had already winning, but they destroyed the South, driving it into total poverty. And this created a reaction in the South that has lasted until this day. The bitterness of the Northern triumph. And this is what happened in Germany after World War I. The bitterness of the Western triumph was so great that Hitler was able to coalesce this rage and this resentment and to rise once again. Well, the West learned that lesson. And so at the end of World War II, instead of creating onerous terms from which Germany could never rise up again, they lent them a helping hand. Instead of breaking them up, they did split them in two. And the West would like to say, it was the Russians who wanted half of Germany. But let me assure you, the West didn't want Germany in its present form. So they gladly gave half of Germany to the Russians and split them up in two. In fact, when that wall came down in 1991, around then, there was a meeting, a secret meeting between Margaret Thatcher and Mikhail Gorbachev. And Margaret Thatcher wanted to assure her Russian, quote, friend, that the West had no problem with Germany being a communist country. In fact, we rather would like you to keep it that way. All right? Because the West was afraid of what would happen when Germany reunited again, from a geopolitical point of view. Well, Gorbachev noted this. It was written down. In fact, when the Russians collapsed as an empire, the news finally came out that the West had hoped that Russia would not allow East Germany to escape its communist clutches. It's all about power. Now, what happened in Japan was very, very different. Japan was smashed into smithereens with a bomb. But what happened is Japan needed to export, and they needed it. And they saw the United States as a far more superior power. Just as Japan had seen Germany as a superior power to Japan in the 19th century, the total crushing defeat of the Japanese forces made Japan realize that the United States was also a superior power. So they decided to emulate what the United States was and had done. And just as they had copied Germany in the 19th century, they went and copied what the United States has done in a Japanese version. The Japanese created an industrial empire because the latter half of the 20th century was going to be the centuries of Japan in the East and Germany in the West, because they were industrial. It was the rise of industrial powers. And the Japanese and the Germans, not only did they have a communality and a tendency towards fascism, they had an ingrained ability to make things better than anybody else. German cars were better than American cars. And eventually Japanese cars were better than American cars too. German optics were better than the optics of anybody else. And in the East, the Japanese copied the German optics and became also triumphant. Well, what happened was this. Germany rose out of the ashes to become the industrial power in Europe once again. And so did Japan, except the Japanese had the fatal flaw of leveraging the debt-based paper money of the West. What they did was they realized what drove Western prosperity was the Western banks. When the Japanese took over Hong Kong and they found the British bankers there, they put guns to the head of the bankers and in 1943 laid them up against the wall and said, "Tell us how this system works." And the bankers spilled their guts, and after the war, the Japanese created a system where the West could not come in. The West could not break the ring that the Japanese Zaibatsu had set up around their corporations, because they knew the West, if they couldn't take them over with guns, were going to buy them with their paper money. So the Japanese made sure that the West couldn't do this. But what the Japanese didn't do was, they didn't realize that the West paper money contained a fatal flaw. And they took that flaw into their system. And so in the 1980s, when the Japanese started taking over the rest of the world because of their superior products, the superior quality, the superior and cheaper prices, and just started disseminating the Western industrial power, they had taken on the fatal flaw of the West in themselves, let credit run rampant, and created the greatest bubble the world had ever seen since the 1920s. The collapse of the 1929 stock market took the world into a Great Depression. Well, the collapse of the Japanese stock market in 1990 did the same thing to Japan. Japan has never recovered from the collapse of its bubble. That bubble was the largest bubble since the collapse of the 1929 stock market bubble. Since that bubble, the Japanese stock market has never recovered, and neither has their property market. Only 20 years later, another bubble came. Well, 10 years later than that. The Japanese bubble collapsed in 1990, and now the dot-com bubble in the United States collapsed in 2000, and the U.S. stock market bubble collapsed in 2008. What I want to tell you is this. Just as much as Japan copied the United States, we have followed in their footsteps and created a bubble even larger than Japan's. Japan has never recovered from the collapse of its bubble in 1990, and neither will the United States. We are scrambling to do so. We have thrown trillions of dollars into the machine trying to restart it. But the dynamic of an economic collapse in a credit-based system where debt becomes so large, leveraged debt becomes so large that no amount of credit can reverse and restart the system. That is what happened in Japan in 1990. That is what is happening in the United States right now. And we are trying to say we can do better. Well, wasn't it what Obama said? We can do better. We're not going to. Better is going to emerge. Truly, a better world is going to emerge out of the dust and destruction of the present economic system of inequity and inequality that favored the bankers over the rest of us. A better day is coming, but it's not here yet. Next program, I'll talk about what happened to China.